Hello listeners, and welcome to the Montel Weekly Podcast, bringing the most topical energy matters in an informal setting. My name is Richard Sverrisson, and I'm joined today by my colleague Olav Vilnes, who's Montel's Nordic Chief Editor. Our guest today is Marius Holm, Rennesund, analyst and partner at Thema, an Oslo-based consultancy. A warm welcome to you, Marius.
Thank you very much.
Today, we return to the issue of wind power in the Nordic region. Quite a sensitive topic at the moment for several reasons, I think. We talked about this earlier in the year, Marius, and things have moved on since then. There have been several onshore protests in several regions of Norway. What's the current status, Marius?
There's now also been established a anti-wind organization that spans across Norway. So the opposition has really gained traction over the past 4 or 5 months. We've also seen that where the regulator published their national framework on wind power, and that sparked even more opposition, and they in fact had to withdraw that framework. So I think it's a more difficult situation for wind investors now than it was the last time we talked.
Okay, even 5 months ago.
Even 5 months ago.
We'll return to the sort of roadmap that was laid out by the regulator a bit later on, but I just want to touch on this element. So the protests are building, the opposition is building. Does that mean the companies are getting very nervous here? Are developers pulling out, or has it not quite reached that? I mean, there are some big international companies investing in wind in Norway.
Well, it's difficult to say. I mean, we had kind of a rush to get the projects online before the end of 2021 to be able to get our certificates. So most of those projects, they're still there. They will be built. They've started to build them. So what's interesting is what will happen beyond 2021. We, in our best view also before this opposition came, thought that it would kind of flatten out the investments in onshore wind because you see so much coming the next few years. Whether players will withdraw, I think that's an interesting topic to discuss. What we see is that some of the regional Norwegian power companies now actually got mandates to invest in wind before this debate sparked. Some of them say that, well, we're a local utility, we know the area, we know the people, we can handle the public opposition, and we can involve people in a good way, and they will still move forward with these projects. Others are, I think, a bit of skeptical and more afraid than they were 5 months ago. On the foreign developers and foreign pension funds companies, there's also a mixed picture, I would guess. Some of them have kind of an arm's length distance to this, and I guess we'll still see that the resources are very good here, and we'll try to get the best projects and the projects where the opposition is less, while others might be more reluctant to invest here. We have even had some talks about some of the foreign utilities that they have said that they consider selling some of their assets if the opposition is so fierce that it has been.
And just to touch on the opposition, I mean, is it mere NIMBYism, or is it more, is these more kind of environmental groups who are protesting against potentially the danger to bird life or the way that they look in sort of areas of natural beauty? Are those the main areas?
Yeah, I think both of those areas are important, but we see more of a kind of classical local environment, nature reserves, etc., versus the climate issue. So it's the opposition thinks that we spoil unspoiled nature across Norway. Well, for foreign investors building wind power that we don't really need because we're moving towards a surplus of power in the Nordics.
Of course,
So I think the fact that most of the investments and most of the owners are now foreign, and that most of the power will be exported, even though we foresee a increase in power demand in Norway and the Nordics, I think that has kind of put an extra push to the opposition.
Okay, so it's the nasty foreigners coming in, bespoiling beautiful Norwegian nature. Yes.
Yeah, that's what we see, and that's kind of the most vocal part of the opposition, at least feels that way.
But then, of course, if you've got local communities involved or local and regional power companies, then they should be making the point that a lot of the revenues from from this will be pushed back into local services, and is that point being made strongly as well?
Well, I don't think the utilities have been good enough to communicate this, both in terms of taxes that come back to the local community, property tax for now. There's also propositions of additional taxes in the future, but it's difficult to tax it too hard when it just have reached kind of maturity and being profitable measured against the power price alone. I think for the local utilities and investors, it is important to focus on what it in fact gives back to the local community.
Yeah, but of course it's difficult to get that message across if it's it's a very emotive issue. Of course, nature and the environment, so it's tricky. It's a very fine balancing act.
It's a fine balancing act, and also the kind of local near issues and weight that against the global climate issues. That's also a balancing act and difficult for all involved parties to do.
I think a large part of the protesters' anger was against what they perceived as a roadmap for the expansion of wind power in Norway by the regulator, the NVE. What's happened since then? I mean, you mentioned that maybe they backtracked a bit, they've withdrawn that roadmap. What are the reasons for that? Is that just in light of the local opposition?
I think that's one important factor, but I also think it's kind of a misperception of what that roadmap was. It was a roadmap and not a plan of how much to build and exactly where to build it. It was 13 different areas that were deemed most suitable for wind development, both in terms of less environmental impact and good wind resources, etc. But I think it has been perceived as we will build as much as we can in these 13 areas. And we had a TV debate just a couple of weeks ago where the host actually continuously was saying that in these 13 areas we will or we can build 500 TWh of new wind power, which is very far from what would happen. It might be technically feasible, but it will never happen economically, and you will never get licenses for
500 terawatt hours.
Yeah,
that's the power demand of Germany.
Yes, exactly. It's 3.5 times the power demand of Norway. So it doesn't make any sense. But of course, for people who don't know the power market, that's a number that kind of sticks in your head, that we will build an incredible amount of new wind power that we don't need. And I think that's also been a problem or a challenge with this roadmap, to kind of clearly communicate what it is and what it is not. And it is not a plan for how much and exactly where to build them. And it's not a plan saying that you will automatically get the license if you build in this area. So there's also been a challenge in how this roadmap have been communicated.
So in a way, you could say that the government saw the public reaction to the roadmap, and then they just, instead of backing the NVE roadmap, they just said, okay, we listen to the people and we withdraw this and start to scratch. So in a way, you're back to where you were before. Yeah,
I think so. Now, I mean, the licensing system, they now said, will be revised. So that's an important development after this roadmap was published. And in a way, they're saying that it wasn't good enough the way it was. And I think one of the reasons for that is it's been, at least in the public opinion, too easy to change the layout and the height of wind towers and wind farms after you got the license. So many have been surprised. What was agreed when the license were issued was a tower height that was far less than what you actually has been realized. So that has been one issue with this. But yes, they've gone back to basically the system we had before. You can build all across Norway as long as you get a license.
You just presented a long-term study where you looked at the potential for reducing, if there is a full stop of handing out new licenses to Norwegian wind farms. What kind of an impact do you think this new policy environment, political environment, have for the future of wind power projects in Norway?
We basically run 3 different scenarios concerning this onshore wind development. And we looked at one case where we actually stopped all wind investments in Norway beyond what has now reached a final investment decision. And of course, if you don't get any other investments, if it's not replaced by other capacity, you will have a power price effect of roughly €2 per megawatt. So it's not huge, but of course it's some. One of the reasons it's not that big is that we also, in our best guess case, expect less wind investments after 2021 when the kind of push for getting L certificates is gone. And if it's replaced by either offshore wind or maybe onshore wind in Sweden, or a combination of that, the price effect will be less, around €1 per megawatt. We also compare that to not our best guess case, but a case where you can invest anywhere, not only in those 13 areas, but across Norway, and you get a price effect of roughly €3 per megawatt. So there's definitely an effect, but it's not that big. And the reason for that is that it's so much wind capacity coming online in Norway over the next year and a half. Yes, it will definitely have an effect, but it's most likely that it will be replaced partly by wind elsewhere in the Nordics, in Sweden, where the opposition is growing there as well, but it's much less than what we see in Norway. And you would also most likely see more gas-fired power production in Germany and Northern Europe to replace some of that wind that would otherwise come in.
From Norway. Yeah. And what you mentioned Sweden here, Marius. I mean, it's interesting here. Do you think an opposition is growing there? Are they looking to what's happening in Norway, both the opposition and the companies that are developing? I mean, the developers may be getting a bit nervous. Opposition growing. I mean, what's happening both in Sweden and in Finland?
Well, I think we see some growth in the opposition in Sweden, but Sweden is in a very different situation than Norway. First of all, they've got a gradual build-out since 2003 of wind. In Norway, you didn't get much capacity coming online before, the last 18 months or so. So they're more used to this development. They're more used to seeing wind farms, and it's a more central, people live more centralized in Sweden, so it's less people living where the wind farms in fact are built. So that's also a factor. But
and of course it's not as beautiful as Norway.
Of course it's not. So yes, I think we might see some more resistance also in Sweden, but my best guess is that some of that capacity that maybe not will be built in Norway, would be built in Sweden instead, and that some of the foreign investors will look more to Sweden now than just 5 months ago.
A main driver in Sweden has, of course, been the LCERT scheme, which came early on in Sweden. It came in the early 2000s, and then Norway joined the market in 2012. But now, last week, the Swedish energy minister, he said that Sweden may end the scheme already in 2021.
Yeah.
Which is the previous plan was to end stopping subsidies in 2030.
Yeah.
Do you think his statements, what do you make of them? Will they could that put a break even to the Swedish development, or is the price of LCERT too low for that?
Yeah, I think the price of LCERT is too low, and even though if you stop it in 2021, you will get an overcapacity in that market and very low prices. So our advice to any investor over the last 2 years has been to look upon the LCERT as a nice add-on, but not put it into your calculations on this project. It's too uncertain, and prices will go down whether they close it in 2021 or 2030.
Because now it's like 30 megawatt hour or something, like €3 per megawatt hour maximum.
Yeah, and it will be approach zero. Probably not go to zero, because there's some cost associated with trading them and having the system up and running, and that's also one of the reasons that the Swedish minister would like to end it early, because basically eventually the prices will be so low that it's just the cost of having the system going. But I think the investors have seen this for quite some time, and with the cost development for onshore wind, which has fallen significantly over the last years, and the increased power prices you see now, with the CO2 price at 25 and the CO2 market at works again, I think that's sufficient to lead to more wind investments in Sweden.
There is also a tricky thing there politically between Norway and Sweden, because as the Norwegian energy minister, he just told us this week that he would not accept the earliest closure in Sweden if it leads to higher elset prices for Norwegian customers. Do you sense a conflict there, or will it stop any reforms?
Yeah, it might stop a reform, but again, I don't think he should be too concerned with higher L certificate prices with an early closure. There are some proposals where you have an early closure and also stop awarding certificates when you reach the 696 million, which is what is stated in the law that should be issued. If you do that, you might maintain higher prices for some more years. And I think that's the only option where you do, in fact, not get an L certificate price going to zero, very close to zero over the next couple of years.
And the bottom line is that this joint Norwegian-Swedish target for 2030 will be reached already now in 2021.
Yes, exactly.
I think one of the key elements in the whole picture, Marius, isn't it, that the prices for building onshore wind have tumbled massively. You've got higher power prices. You've got then partly due to higher CO2 prices. This obviously makes the case for building subsidy-free renewables very clear. And instead of looking at the subsidies ways, then you have the big PPA market. But at the same time, you'd think with all the environment that the PPA market would still be booming, but it seems to have cooled off a bit in the Nordics. Is that something you'd share? And what are the reasons for that? Or is it just a temporary blip?
That's difficult to say. Some of the larger industrial players, at least in Norway, have now bought what they need for the coming years. But I think there's still a number of industries in Sweden where we haven't seen that much of new PPAs being completed over the last few years, where there's still a market. And I think we also will see different designs of PPAs, maybe more short-term PPAs, maybe more pooling of smaller industrial customers to one large PPA. There's many ways to structure it, and for the right trader here, there's an opportunity.
But is there a disconnect because maybe some of the developers want shorter term deals, but the customers would want that price security in the long term, 10, 12 years? Is that an issue here?
It could be. It depends on the off-taker. Some are happy with 5, 6, 7 years. The large aluminium players would like, 15, 20. So there might be a discrepancy there, but I think it's possible to overcome that and be actually able to make more deals. I think one important factor here is that we've had all PPAs almost that's come over the last 3 years has been connected to a specific wind farm. And there's a lot of new wind farms now coming online. And everybody wants to have a PPA because it's German pension funds being the owners, and they have a lower or can live with a lower expected return. But in order to do so, they need some security, and a PPA serves that security. And it's a buyer's market because you have so many new projects coming online, and a number of them say that, they won't make money on the PPA. What they will make money on is the period beyond the PPA horizon. So in that way, maybe some of them would like a shorter duration of the PPA as well.
Okay.
And to have more market exposure from year 7, 8, 9, 10.
There is a discrepancy there, it seems, between the prices in the wholesale market and what the analysts expect. That in general you have a higher expectation among most analysts than you see in the market. Yeah,
I think that's something we've seen over the past years. It's difficult to explain that difference. We can, of course, explain why we end up with those prices we do, and the other analysts can as well. But the market doesn't seem to agree with us. We've been a few euros above the forward market for quite some time. On the other hand, going beyond 3 years ahead, the liquidity hasn't been very good at the financial market. So whether that's a good reference or not can of course be discussed.
Sure. But if I understand you correctly, Marius, I think there's going to be a variety of type of deals out there. probably growing in complexity, with different, you could, like, you have the pooling, similar to maybe the Finnish model with nuclear power, that these could sort of grow and grow. So it's far from slowing. It's just taking different shapes, and you expect it to continue to grow.
We do, and it takes some time to come up with new models and new ways of doing this. The straightforward deals maybe has been done now for many of the larger customers, but there's still room for more. And it also depends on the demand growth. Will we see a lot of new data centers coming in? That will lead to even more PPAs and other sectors as well. So what you expect in terms of increased demand will also be important.
If we return to the wind issue, if you mentioned offshore wind, there's also been a debate in Norway, even in Sweden, on expanding offshore. Do you see more of the new production coming there instead of onshore?
Across Europe, we see more onshore wind coming online. If you look at Norway or the Nordics, we can see some developments in the Baltic Sea, but it will take some time before it's actually profitable. I think off the Norwegian coast, it's so deep, so we would have to look at floating wind, which is more expensive. So if we are to see much more offshore wind development there, subsidies are necessary.
What's the price difference today between floating and offshore? Is it very big? Or?
Yeah, it's definitely big. Onshore is now not a mature technology, but more mature technology. And you see that when you look at the auctions in Germany, the Netherlands, Denmark for large offshore wind farms, they often bid a zero subsidy. That doesn't mean they don't get a subsidy, because there's some implicit subsidies with free grid connections, etc. But still, it's now reaching profitability without subsidies, and you would need significant subsidies offshore in Norway
for floating. But do you think there's a sense of saturation of onshore wind in some areas? We're seeing it slowing down quite a lot in Germany. Is this something that you've got the NIMBY issue in Norway, of course, but people don't want these massive turbines close to their homes?
And I think we see that in Germany as well. And eventually there will be some kind of limitation also on the land and then in the areas you can actually build. So I think that might lead to offshore wind being more necessary. But I think that will be driven by other factors than the pure cost. We see that with the opposition in Norway. We see that it sparked a bit debate about onshore. Offshore. Everybody wants offshore now, but they don't have a feeling for how much it will cost. And if you are to subsidize that, I think you do it not to get necessary investments to meet the demand. It's more building offshore wind sector in Norway that could also be exporting floating offshore wind sector in Norway that could also be exporting the technology across Europe. And building a home market in such a setting might be important.
And of course, there are some political drivers as well. If you look at the targets now, Denmark will have a 70% emissions cut by 2030. Yeah. Finland will have claim to be renewable, carbon neutral by 2035. Yeah. And then you have the Norwegian project of electrifying petroleum installations in the North Sea, transport and so forth. But is there a case then for perhaps just do more with the hydropower you already have? There's a good potential there to even boost hydropower output.
But I think also there are some misperception. There's a report out saying that there's a potential in upgrades of 30-40 TWh. We've gone through that report in detail, and it's basically based on a master study with very limited data going into it. So we think that potential is far less. 5 TWh potential is more likely if you look at what has happened over the last few years, where you have actually upgraded 50% of the Norwegian hydropower and received those 5 TWh, and there's probably a potential for the equal amount on the next or the last 50% that could be upgraded. That's far from enough to offset what you could have gotten in onshore wind. But of course, a combination of some onshore wind, some upgrades in hydropower, maybe some more small-scale hydropower, although with the tax report that came out a few weeks ago, the world looks a little bit more bleak for them. But I think we will get the combination of all these technologies, and probably also some offshore wind also in Norway. But but not in the near future. That will come in the 30s.
So I think if I were to sum up, I'd say, there's still a lot of potential for onshore, mainly for onshore, a little bit for offshore. Yeah. But we're looking at, wind being the big driver here in terms of generation capacity and the impact on prices going forward. So I think that's about all from me. So thank you very much, Marius, and thank you, Olav. So listeners, please keep up to date with all the latest energy stories on Montel News, and follow us on Twitter and LinkedIn, and you can subscribe on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Thank you. Goodbye.